Today's episode features Nick from Rooted Leaf Nutrients. He's back on the program to talk about water contaminants that could not only just be harming you, but could be harming your plants and your soil life. On this episode, we give you an incredible tool that lets you check what's in your water remotely online. I know you're going to love that. Plus, Nick gives a breakdown on how you're probably using your RO filter incorrectly, and he gives tips on how to make it more efficient and increase the durability. This episode is brought to you by ACinfinity.com for all the best grow gear, tents, the whole grow kit, fans, filters, pots, whatever you need. It's at ACinfinity.com. Use code GROWCAST15 to get the biggest savings always. And of course, rootedleaf.com for the best nutrients in the game. Code GROWCAST gets you 20% off. Thank you for listening, everybody, and enjoy the show. Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to and watching GrowCast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in again today. Before we get started, go to growcast.com. There you will find all the archives of all the episodes now on video, plus the membership, the seeds, the classes. It's all there at growcast.com. Hit like, hit subscribe. If you learn anything in this episode, drop a comment below, share it with a friend. It really helps us out at the show, and it costs nothing, so we appreciate it. Special thank you to the GrowCast members. Today, we've got a return guest. You know him, you love him. I'm so excited to talk to him again today about water constituents. We're going to talk about reverse osmosis water. We're going to talk about forever chemicals and contaminants. It's going to be a good one, folks. Back from Rooted Leaf, we have none other than Nick himself. What's up, Nick? How you doing?
Hey, Jordan. I'm doing pretty well, man. How are you?
Doing excellent. Thank you for coming back on the show. I'm super excited for this one.
Yeah, me too.
Your last episode on the oxygen evolution complex was excellent. If you have not seen that episode, be sure to go back and watch that one right after this one. But Nick, let's just jump right into it today. Of course, rootedleaf.com, code GROWCAST for all your lovely offerings. But I want to talk about what we put that Rooted Leaf into today. I want to talk about water, really starting just from the basics and going all the way into, like I said, contaminants and filtration. It's going to be a good one. Let's start from a 30,000-foot view. Talk to us about how water isn't just water. Water is not created equally, whether it's well water, tap water, whether it's unfiltered or it's been filtered. The stuff that we're using is not necessarily the same as the grower next door. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different properties of water, I guess you could say, that make it such that not all water is going to be the same. And even if you start with something that has nothing inside of the water, like let's say you have an ultra pure reverse osmosis system or like an ion exchange system or something that's extremely elaborate that's set up to have like multiple filtration stages, you're going to end up with water that has nothing inside of it. But even that water may not have the correct properties. So you would want to do things like maybe soften it, add minerals back in. Sometimes adding minerals back into RO water has a lot to do with the systems that they're run through, but there's also certain cases where maybe you'd want to look at certain metabolic effects or reactions or just the kind of interactions that RO water can have. So without getting too far into that right now, you know, like you've got RO water basically on one end. Then you've got something a little bit more standard and typical, like your tap water, for instance, just kind of, and that's variable too. You know, I live here in the Pacific Northwest, and I think my tap water probably comes out with about 30 ppm. So, but now somewhere in the spectrum of various places, you know, starting waters, for example, you've got a certain point where minerals start to become a little bit more relevant. If we're talking about well water, for example, oftentimes it has some calcium or has some magnesium content. And if your well is sourced near some industrial areas where industrial activity occurs, it could also be higher in sulfur. So you may have like magnesium sulfate as a constituent of the well water. So, you know, in those cases, you may want to try to deal with what's in the water or otherwise try to make it work for you in your particular situation.
Right. That's got to be a nightmare for someone like you, though. You work day and night to make a perfectly balanced nutrient solution for a very specific plant. But the water you start with is going to be a huge contributor to that. Like you said, if your water is full of calcium bicarbonate and magnesium sulfate, you know, I remember growing up and being over at a friend's house and you run the tap and water smells like eggs, you know, and they were like, oh, our well is high in sulfur. Well, you know, not the worst thing that your well could be bringing into your grow. And we'll talk about that in a second. But from your perspective, it's like you have to know where you're starting from. And it does not surprise me that you like starting from a clean slate, because otherwise I'm sure you have to adjust if your well water is coming out this high ppm, you know. I guess it just depends on the source, right? Is that why it's so important to get a water test, to look at what's in your water to understand it first?
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to be ultra specific, it makes sense to get a water test and then kind of see if you can match a water filtration technology to the specific contaminant that you have.
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, you have to piece together multiple components to create a system where you can take things out like heavy metals and take things out like pharmaceuticals and other complex organic matter. And then even if we're talking about maybe your tertiary branch of, let's call them forever chemicals or compounds that are very difficult to break down. There's some, I don't want to get too far into it, but the term forever chemical may actually be misleading in the sense that there are ways to break them down. It's just incredibly difficult.
Sure. And we're discovering those still now, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into that because I want to go over these contaminants that we face and go over them one at a time, because we've talked about on this show before how you can go to ewg.org/tapwater and look through a whole database of recent or semi-recent water tests. You just punch in your zip code and you select the source of water that you're from. If you're on municipal, you'll be able to see a test for that water. And so when we do this live for the members on Growcast TV, Nick, everyone punches in their zip code into the chat and we look and we show how many. And it wildly varies, man. We're talking lead that's 100, 200, 300 times the recommended EWG levels. And then just right around the corner, they don't have that lead for whatever reason. Someone said it had to do with the pipes that the water's carried in. Mm-hmm. It's really complex. And I think heavy metals are the first contaminant that people worry about the most. Do you want to talk about heavy metal contamination in water, what we can do, why it's so bad, and just any thoughts you have on that type of contaminant?
Yeah. And like you said, the construction of the pipes oftentimes is one of the culprits, especially if you get into areas that are maybe a little bit older, if you're dealing with pipes from, the 20s and the 30s versus something a little bit more modern constructed.
That's what they said.
So, yeah, I mean, that's part of the source, but then also you're looking at certain industrial activities. Oftentimes it's literally just, coal burning or, manufacturing of certain components like automotive parts. And even people just driving around on the freeways, your brake dust, you may not see it with your eyes, but every time you brake, there's a little bit of brake dust that gets released. And it doesn't immediately go from your brakes, into the waterways like overnight. But, progressively, this stuff tends to build up in ecosystems over time. So you see this like maybe semi-slow movement throughout the entire ecosystem, but progressively and gradually you do get to the spot where things tend to accumulate in the water tables and the water systems. And then that water gets introduced into wastewater treatment facilities that really aren't set up to deal with these complex pollutants. Like their technology may go back to, the 60s and the 70s, and even some of the more modern wastewater treatment facilities. They don't stay on top of the technology that's capable of removing all of these like complex pollutants nearly as fast as we're capable of, introducing them or bringing them in. So if you look at water filtration technologies for heavy metals, for example, those are a little bit different than something like forever chemicals, because the forever chemicals have much bigger structures. They're like complex molecules, but the heavy metals themselves tend to be individual elements. And so like the way that we deal with them is a little bit different. And certainly the way that it impacts plants is also a little bit different. So, let's just say we do have some heavy metals that are introduced into our source water, and that gets, ends up being put in a reservoir. We make, a batch of feed water, and then we put that into the soil. The question is, well, how does the heavy metal then interact with the soil? There are certain types of exudates that plants produce that will kind of bind and catch and otherwise, neutralize these compounds. I don't want to get on the plant-centric side of things. I just want to point out that our filtration technologies actually kind of take the same approach. What we're trying to do is bind and capture them with things like ion exchange resin filters, where the heavy metal comes in and it has a very strong charge density because it's a single element. The charge isn't spread across like you would find in a forever chemical, but it comes into one side of the filter, and on the other side of the filter you may get a similar charge kicked out, like hydrogen, for example, and that will just either lower the pH of your clean water by a little bit, or it'll recombine if you have a multi-stage filter that also neutralizes negatively charged compounds that will exchange for hydroxyl. So the hydroxyl and the proton come together and they neutralize to make water. Some of these membrane filters, the technology is actually pretty complex. Like some of them are better suited towards heavy metals and they don't really mess with calcium and magnesium. So if you're trying to treat well water and just scrub out all the heavy metals without like necessarily taking out all the calcium, maybe you want some of it in because it's healthy, or maybe you just don't want to put a bunch of extra wear and tear on the filter because the calcium won't damage your plants, right? It's the heavy metals in the feed water that might. So there are membranes out there for these filters that will catch preferentially, to some extent. It's not perfect, but they'll preferentially catch heavy metals as opposed to your calcium, magnesium, and your potassium.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Come and join Growcast membership. It's the best community in cannabis cultivation, hands down. Growcast.com/membership will tell you all about it, but all you need to know is every grower needs one, and we're waiting to invite you into our cultivation family right now. Not only will we help you in your garden and give you 24/7 garden support, 365, walking you through any troubles you have and teaching you how to identify those issues later down the road, but we also give you a whole host of content, bonus live streams for members, Q&As where you can get all your questions answered, all sorts of good content from PDF visual resources all the way to quick hit videos and long form live streams. It is a blast in Growcast membership. And the best part is we've got all sorts of grow alongs and meetups and events so you can connect with growers just like you all across the globe. We've got chapters in each part of the US and we're doing great events, great meetups. You don't want to miss out. Growing should be fun and easy, and Growcast membership makes it just that. Growcast.com/membership. Come and join us. We're waiting to welcome you into our cultivation family. Growcast.com/membership. Join now. 50% off your first month. I know you're going to love it, and I'll see you there, everybody.
Aside from the heavy metals, you say that these other more recently discovered and utilized chemicals, forever chemicals, there's a wide group of them. There's a lot of different kinds. Like you said, they're a result of industry. They're a result of all these different forms of contamination. But the point of these forever chemicals is that they're very, very hard to get rid of, right? Or like you said, people were saying impossible to get rid of, thus forever. I know that's changing. But what are these chemicals? How do they affect us? And also, how do they negatively affect plants? Because I always hear about them in terms of human health. But what about the plants themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the usual suspects for forever chemicals are going to be like PCBs and dioxins that are extremely persistent in the environments. They can take decades to break down. And I think only up until recently, there was no microbe that was known to remediate them. So that the issue isn't so much that they're persistent. It's that when they break down under certain conditions, they end up becoming a little bit more potent than the parent form. And they're also more persistent as well.
So they really build up over time in the system, like you said.
Besides those, there's also, I think, groups of compounds that are produced at the water treatment facilities themselves when they're actually doing the water treatment. So depending on the types of chemicals they use, they will end up inadvertently creating some toxins that have to be dealt with on the filtration side. You know?
That's what we saw when we were doing those EWG searches. Haloacetic acids, another large group of compounds, but basically, if you look into it on the website, it says these are created from the bleaches and chlorines or whatever sort of disinfectants they're using on your water. And it's killing the bad stuff, but it's also creating these new compounds. And these were some of the worst offenders, Nick, in the levels that we saw. We saw 1,000 times the EWG recommended dosage on some of these results. Sure. And that's just not okay. Again, we hear about these things being deposited into like fruits and vegetables and then us eating them, but they can also just disrupt the plant, right? And stop a whole bunch of processes that plants need to do.
Yeah, and I think those HAAs are produced as a result of chlorine being used, whether it's like hypochlorous acid or chlorine dioxide or even regular old bleach. Because at water treatment facilities, it's not like there's like neat and orderly and organized groups of materials. It's literally everything just at once gets filtered out. So there's a lot of these like sideways interactions that can occur. And one of those is the formation of these HAAs, which I think do come out with water filtration techniques. I think you might have to run it through some kind of like a carbon-based filtration system or like a coconut-based. I think they basically just take like the husk of the coconut. It's not coco coir, but they take the outer husk and they make biochar out of that, basically, is effectively. So if you've ever seen like coconut shell filtration, that's effectively what it is. It's like
wow, I did not know
that. Use
that
it as a filtration medium. Yeah, because the surface area is very high. And because the surface area is very high, you can introduce a large amount of these organic contaminants and forever chemicals, and they just kind of get lodged in this like very dense, complex network of charged, surfaces. And like, it's crazy how high the density in the surface area can get.
Really important to filter these things out because they're just bad for plants. They interrupt photosynthesis. They really disrupt these plants just as badly as they disrupt humans. So let's talk about eliminating them. How about using activated charcoal? How about using carbon and running your water through it? What's going on there to decontaminate it?
They may not do a lot for your heavy metals. So the coconut shell will do a lot for like the organic complex molecules, your forever chemicals, your HAAs and things like that. But the heavy metals, maybe not so much.
Man,
the
that's
heavy
so
metals
cool.
would require more of like this ion exchange approach. And that's also something that's fundamentally different than RO systems, I should say too.
The power of the coconut, Nick.
Yeah.
It's very, very intense, very powerful.
Yeah.
So on the subject of RO, reverse osmosis, we're all familiar with the process of osmosis. People refer to this type of water as a solvent because it is so free of things that it just wants to grab onto anything, and how water is nature's solvent. Tell me if you agree with that, and how we should be looking at reverse osmosis water as a blank slate.
Well, I would respectfully disagree with that. I think the ideal or optimum one would probably be vapor distilled water, because that truly has nothing inside of it. The issue with RO water that I see is that it's just basically like RO systems require pressure in order to operate. You can't use RO with low water pressure. And the reason specifically is because the screen is extremely, extremely fine. So what ends up happening is the water gets pushed through under force. And because it gets pushed through under force, there's a certain loss that's associated with it. But there's also this sort of like side effect that's associated with it, which is that if you start with a very high ppm going into the RO filter, you can end up on the effluent stream. Your so-called ultra pure water could end up having 25 to 50 ppms left over because the stuff got forced through. It's not a perfect way of filtering out. And in fact, when you look at the way that RO systems are set up and plumbed, they're usually the final step. You have like a basic 2-stage or 3-stage, sediment filter or pre-filter. And then after that, you run it through an organic material filter via the coconut shell or the activated charcoal or something like that, a little bit more robust, larger surface area. And then you may also, if you're dealing with a large amount of heavy metals, you may then run that through an ion exchange filter, because the ion exchange filter will grab the individual atoms, the individual elements, like your heavy metals, your aluminum, for example, which is much smaller than the larger organic contaminants. Those forever chemicals have a larger molecular size. So you progressively kind of whittle this down. And after your ion exchange filter, then that would actually go into your RO system. And the RO system, you don't want to have a lot of wear and tear, because again, it takes a high amount of pressure just to operate, because you're just forcing water through a semi-permeable filter that's so small that not even water wants to pass through it. It only passes through it under pressure. You can't just like gravity drip and gravity feed the RO system. It just won't work. The filter will exclude the water as well. So anything you can do to reduce the load on the RO filter will save you money, because the RO filters are very expensive. Meanwhile, the sediment, / pre-filter cartridges, those are like $20. I can get them right now on Amazon, delivered at 5 p.m. today. The RO filter is going to take a little bit of time.
Man, that just absolutely blew my mind. I've seen people have this problem. I've had this problem myself. You plug the RO filter right into your wall, right? And then all that pressure, like you said, being pushed through there and just running the straight contaminated water into this RO. Sometimes it comes out the other end with some resulting ppm, and someone will write me and be like, "Hey, what's the deal with this?" And I've always assumed, and this does contribute to it as well, that their RO is probably worn out at that point. That's usually a sign that it's not functioning properly. But like you said, it could be brand new, and it's just not an effective system to take the first initial highly contaminated, hopefully not, product of your water and then force it with pressure through this filter instead of running it through other filters first and having it be your last stage. That is mind-blowing, Nick. I have never heard that before, and that makes a lot of sense why a lot of us shouldn't just be plugging our wall water right into this RO and then saying go, right?
Yeah, and as an extension of that, I think some of the negative, maybe not negative, but some of the drawbacks you might associate with RO water are actually drawbacks that should be attributed to distilled water instead, because distilled water is the one that's going to have 0 ppms. I mean, it's literally, you're just collecting steam, and it's not like your heavy metals aren't going to be introduced into the stream at all. Like, they're going to concentrate down into, and be left behind. They don't enter the gas phase at the temperature that water does. You'd have to heat them up substantially to make them actually volatilize and become gaseous.
Which is why we don't really use distilled water?
And presumably because it's more expensive, I think.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, distilled water wouldn't, but the reason that I say that is because RO water sometimes comes with this like caveat of electronegativity, and like it's going to strip electrons and things like that, and minerals and stuff like that away from your plants, or like strip your soil or whatever. I think that function should be attributed more to distilled water, which truly has a ppm closer to zero, if not zero itself. It's always hard to actually get pure zero ppm, because even if you have zero ppm water, like let's just say you start off at the end of your steam distillation machine and the steam comes down, you recondenses and you collect it. There's going to be some gas air interactions that occur. There's always some gas that's present out on the outside of your water droplet, and that gas will contain CO2. Carbonic acid may actually end up dissolving inside of the ultra pure water. So like you got to go through great lengths to make it like actually truly
zero.
Right.
Just like the cup of water on the desk collects that CO2. That does make sense. Still an absolute game changer. And what you're saying is maybe not quite as much of a solvent as we're giving it credit for. Yes, it's not the same as that super hard well water, but it's not this like crazy stripper of minerals.
If you think about water, it's really a polar molecule. You have oxygen, you have H2O inside of water molecule, right? But my point is it's not a linear molecule. You have the oxygen and you have the two hydrogens below it. And what this does is this creates zones or a region where there's some charge distribution happening. Some people might refer to it as charge separation, although it's not true because the charge is still confined in the system. But my point is that water is a polar molecule, and you have a positive charge and you have a negative charge basically associated with where the oxygen sits and where the hydrogen sits, specifically because of the geometry of that water molecule. You have the oxygen on top and you've got the two hydrogens below. You've seen that classic ball and stick diagram. Everybody has, but I want people to think about, like, in terms of a magnet, what would that look like? Because the oxygen is more electronegative and the protons themselves have the positivity to compensate for it, but it's not an equal compensation. So if you can understand this property of this charge distribution happening on this polar molecule, then it makes sense why ions can dissolve inside of water. If I have calcium and nitrate, I have calcium, which is positively charged, and I have nitrate, which is negatively charged, right? Those dissolve in water because oxygen and hydrogen each play a role in the calcium and in the nitrate, kind of stabilizing the two of them so that they can actually properly dissolve and become separated, if you will, due to the dielectric constant of water. The more stuff that you put into water, obviously, it modifies the dielectric constant. If you have a higher EC, for example, it'll do things like alter the osmotic potential, which changes the tendency of the behavior of the feed water solution. You can also put in certain ingredients that modify water activity and do all this other fun stuff. So there's complex ways of working with just even plain pure water.
Any final words on water before we get into your recent work?
Man, water chemistry is very complex. I mean, even water filtration equipment and technology is very complex. I would say it's in everyone's interest to understand their water very well, get to know it, even if it's just something as simple as profiling what's in the tap water, like getting some kinds of nutrient strips and just playing around and seeing like what's the concentration of various elements. If you can do that, anyways, if not, get the water tested and analyzed. I will say most of the problems that growers experience has to do with watering, just in terms of watering practices like overwatering or underwatering. But it's also really important if you over or underwater, if you're concerned about over or underwatering, to understand what is in your water too, because that could be contributing to some of the problems that you might be correctly tracing back to something to do with the water. You know, the volume of water will relate heavily to the volume of contaminant introduced to the plant. And so if you see some stress and you think it's water related, it's definitely worth your while to dig into your water a little bit and just see if you can find out what's in it, if there's anything in it at all. That website that you mentioned sounds like a great resource. What was it again?
ewg.org/tapwater will bring you right there. And it's really fun. You can punch in your thing there. And they also help with what you're saying, Nick, which is once you know what's in your water and you need to get rid of it, they'll tell you what type of filter knocks out which thing. So like you said, the multi-stage, obviously the best, but if you've got that heavy metal contamination, you better make sure you have that ion type filter, I believe you said. Otherwise, you're just missing the target with these different contaminants. So very important stuff.
Yeah. And I'm just looking up my water right now for my city, and I'm 359 times over the HAA limit or the HAA 5 limit, and 650 times over the HAA 9 limit. So in this case, for me personally, I'm glad that I use the water filter that I do at home, because I don't have to worry about any of that. It's an ion exchange filter, and I make sure it gets swapped out many, many times each year. But thankfully I don't have to swap it out too often. It makes my tea taste a lot better too. That's what I'll say.
It does. It definitely affects the coffee brew. And
Yes.
we were seeing, if you can get as low as like 3 to 7 total contaminants over the recommended limit, that's like low. There was ones as high as like 14, 21, upwards of 30 contaminants that exceeded the EWG health guidelines. So it's pretty sad, Nick, that in a world where, we live with a lot of luxuries, where the chat was cheering when somebody would have only 5 contaminants that are over the EWG limit. That's pretty crazy if you think about it, man. And I think we need to pay a little more attention to our water quality, if you ask me.
Yeah, and just become more familiar with some of the water filtration, devices and techniques that are out there. I mean, ChatGPT makes it simple to break it down in simple terms. So I would recommend people kind of look into that, just like as categories in general, or more specific. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a variety of different mediums that you can use, like ultra-specific membranes or ultra-specific types of activated charcoal media or activated carbon media, depending on your specific, your specific needs. So use ChatGPT, and then it also looked like that EWG tool also has a list of ability. Like if you punch in your zip code, I'm seeing right here, it says find a filter, and it kind of recommends what filter I should use to pull out all of these different contaminants. So that's nice. You could also run it through ChatGPT, and
that's nice. That's so funny, man. It's a crazy world we live in. But let's talk about the good things in the water next. Let's talk about Rooted Leaf. What are you working on? Give us a teaser, at least one teaser. We need a teaser. And also talk about one product that people should go try today if they're just seeing this.
Yeah, I mean, all of the products, the Gen 3 products, are like very interesting in their own unique ways. I think I was talking to you earlier off cam about how I just made a batch of resin bloom that, it's the same ingredients, it's the same Gen 3 resin bloom, but because we own the manufacturing, I have a nice ability to do whatever I want. So that means like slightly different order of operations, maybe slightly different parameters for certain steps. And I think I found something that in the way of how resin bloom is made that is going to end up making a pretty substantial difference. At least I hope. So it's the same product, same formula, same analysis, but just made with a little bit of extra love for the formulation overall. So I will say Peak Bloom was probably the one that just became a heavy hitter overnight with the Gen 3 upgrades. But there's this very special element of Peak Bloom, something that we learned how to deal with. That's been kind of captivating my interest recently, and that's maybe a teaser for the next episode. Could be a discussion around various types of phosphorus nutrition in plants. I know a lot of people are familiar with like monopotassium phosphate salts and like bone meal, but not a lot of people are familiar with how sugar phosphates can be fed successfully into plants. And so I want to try to break apart this thing that I'm just, loosely referring to as the sugar phosphate scaffold. And then as we look at how cannabinoids are synthesized, how terpenes are synthesized, even if we look at how phosphorus is stored in seed forms for the next generation, the viability of the offspring, the strong expressions of that seed, sugar phosphates are like little rungs on a ladder that will ultimately inform everything. I'm talking about sugar phosphates as being like the origin point for all terpenes. I'm talking about sugar phosphates as being the origin for all cannabinoids. And then also for storage for the subsequent generation, the way that plants process sugar phosphates allows them to actually introduce that stored form of phosphorus to the next generation. Yeah.
I can't wait, Nick. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. Rootedleaf.com. That's where you need to go if you're not completely satisfied with the nutrients that you're using, or if you just want to try something new. Okay, it's loaded with carbon. You don't need to pH anymore, folks. I'm using it right now. I'm loving it. And you can use code GROWCAST. Don't forget code GROWCAST for 20% off. At The Rooted Leaf on Instagram. Come and see us at an event soon, hopefully with Nick. Would love to have you at something out our way. Any final words, Nick, before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I like the new format. I'm looking forward to doing more episodes like this. So I appreciate the time, and great to be here as always.
Appreciate you, man. Stay tuned, listeners. We got more coming your way. Growcast.com for all the things, the classes, the meetups. Everything is up there. The seeds, the membership. I'll see you there. Most importantly, be safe out there. This is Nick and me, Jordan River, signing off, saying stick around with Growcast so you never have to grow alone. Bye, everybody. Peace.
That's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to Nick from Rooted Leaf. Of course, rootedleaf.com, code GROWCAST for 20% off. ACinfinity.com, code GROWCAST15 for all of your grow gear needs. And don't forget the Natural Farming Autumn Immersive with OK Calyx is coming up in just 2 weeks. If you're interested in coming to this class, go ahead and shoot me a message. Shoot me an email, contact@growcast.com. We'll get you hooked up with a last-minute discount code, and you can come down October 11th and or October 12th. Day 1 for beginners, day 2 for advanced. Come and see us. It's a life-changing class. Really want to see you there. And please hit us up if you have any questions. That's all for today. Be safe out there, everybody. Love each other. Special thank you to the members. And I'll see you next time. Bye.